The heavy Pacific storms that batter the Oregon coastline in November don't knock before they enter. They throw their weight against the cedar siding of my house, testing the structural integrity of the timber, searching for a weakness to exploit. I know the sound of a frame under siege better than most men know their own reflection. For 44 years, I built deep-water commercial fishing trawlers out of the Astoria boatyards. I understand exactly how white oak and marine epoxy groan when they are fighting the violent pull of the tide. But on that specific Tuesday night, at exactly 2:14 in the morning, the sound that shattered the quiet of my house wasn't the howling squall ripping through the Sitka spruces outside. It was a low mechanical thrumming. I lay perfectly still in the dark, my spine, fused in two places from a half-century of hauling wet rigging, flared with a dull, throbbing heat. I didn't reach for the brass lamp on the nightstand. I just listened. The rhythmic vibration was rattling the single-pane glass of my bedroom window. It was a heavy diesel engine idling on the crushed oyster shells of my private driveway. Out here, perched on a steep bluff overlooking the deep-water marina, I had spent my life expanding. No one takes a wrong turn. You don't accidentally drive 10 miles down an unlit, winding coastal road in the middle of a gale. If an engine is idling outside your home in the dead of night, it means the driver has come with a purpose. I pushed the heavy wool quilt aside. The freezing hardwood floor bit violently into the soles of my feet. My breath plumed faintly in the frigid air of the room. Since Sarah's heart finally gave out 8 months ago, the sprawling, 3-story historic house had become a cavernous, echoing museum of her absence. The silence she left behind had a physical weight, pressing down on my chest every time I inhaled. I moved through the dark toward the window, my right knee-eye grinding with an audible click. The heavy curtain just a fraction of an inch. Down below, bathed in the harsh, strobe-like glare of halogen headlights cutting through the driving rain, sat a vehicle. It was a sterile, white medical transport van, unmarked. The exhaust pipe spewed thick, white clouds of vapor into the freezing downpour, the bloody red glow of the brake lights, reflected off the wet gravel, and then I saw the silhouettes, 3 dark, shapeless figures moving up the front brick walkway toward my wraparound porch, leaning heavily against the wind. They didn't ring the bell. They didn't pound their fists against the wood. Directly beneath me, the heavy brass deadbolt on my solid oak front door turned with a sickening metallic clack. My pulse dropped straight into my stomach, leaving a cold, copper taste of pure adrenaline on the back of my tongue. It wasn't a lock being forced or kicked in. It was a key sliding perfectly into the oiled tumbler. Only 3 people in the world possessed a physical copy of that key. One was currently sleeping beneath the freezing earth in the cemetery over the ridge. One was currently standing in my downstairs hallway, and the third was me. When a man spends his life working with heavy machinery in unpredictable oceans, he learns very quickly that panic is the thing that drowns you long before the water ever does. I didn't shout. I pulled on my thick flannel shirt, slid my feet into my leather work boots without bothering to tie the laces, and stepped out of the bedroom. The hallway was swallowed in absolute darkness. The air smelled faintly of old cedar, and the sharp, ozone tang of the storm leaking through the weather stripping. "Just get the lights on, Julian. It smells like a tomb in here." The voice drifted up the grand stairwell, sharp and nasal, cutting through the damp air like a serrated edge. Clara, my daughter-in-law. A heavy industrial click echoed through the foyer, and the antique brass chandelier flared to life, casting harsh, elongated shadows up the walls. I stood in the darkness at the top of the stairs, looking down into my own home. My son, Julian, stood by the door. He was 39 years old, draped in a tailored wool overcoat that was currently dripping ocean water onto the Persian rug Sarah had imported from Istanbul 20 years ago. He looked hollowed out, his skin held a sickly grayish pallor, and his eyes darted around the foyer with a manic, feral energy. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff, waiting for a gust of wind to push him over. Behind him stood Clara, She was meticulously put together, holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio against her chest like a Kevlar vest. Her sharp blonde bob was completely undisturbed by the storm. Her eyes weren't frantic like Julian's. They were entirely flat, calculating, devoid of anything resembling human warmth. Then, the third man stepped fully into the light. He hovered near the door jamb, a heavy, thick-necked shadow wrapped in a cheap, transparent rain poncho. Beneath the plastic, I could see the faded blue fabric of medical scrubs. He carried a bulky, reinforced black canvas bag. He didn't look at the framed maritime charts on the wall. He just stared straight ahead, chewing methodically on a piece of gum, the kind of man who gets paid by the hour to look the other way. He's probably asleep. Julian wiped rainwater from his forehead with a trembling hand. We're not leaving, Julian. Clara's voice dropped into a register of icy command. We are doing this tonight. The grace period ends on Thursday. Do you understand me? If this isn't signed and filed by tomorrow morning, the syndicate takes everything. We do this now. Dr. Vance has the paperwork and the sedative. You just get him to sign. The sedative. The words hung in the freezing air, heavier than the rain battering the roof. I looked at the black canvas bag in the third man's hand. Suddenly, the sterile white van idling outside made perfect, terrifying sense. This wasn't a desperate visit for a loan. This wasn't an argument over the inheritance. This was a surgical extraction. They had brought a corrupt physician and a chemical restraint to my house at 2 in the morning. If I didn't sign over the marina, the millions of dollars of commercial real estate I had spent my life building, they were going to drug me, drag me into that van, and lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward before the sun came up. I looked at Julian, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged on the docks, the boy I had taught to navigate by the constellations when the GPS failed. I remembered the exact weight of him falling asleep against my shoulder on the deck of our first skiff. Now I searched his face for a flicker of hesitation, a single ounce of shame for the monstrous machinery he had just dragged into my home. There was nothing. The boy I raised was dead, replaced by a desperate, hollow shell clutching a forged key. The grief that hit me wasn't sharp. It was a profound, suffocating ache, like drowning in slow motion. I stepped down onto the first landing. The wood groaned softly beneath my weight, a deep, resonant sound that finally announced my presence. All three of them snapped their heads up toward the darkness of the stairwell. I descended slowly, letting the dim light of the chandelier gradually illuminate my face. I didn't hurry. I moved with the stiff, deliberate gait of a man who has traded his cartilage for a lifetime of hard labor. Julian! My voice was a low, gravelly rasp, barely carrying over the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. You're tracking mud onto your mother's rug. Julian flinched backward. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden tightening of the shoulders, the reflexive reaction of a boy who had just been caught stealing from the till. For a fleeting second, his arrogant facade crumbled. Dad! Julian forced a sickeningly artificial smile that didn't reach his panicked eyes. We didn't want to wake you. The front gate is locked. I kept my tone perfectly flat, completely devoid of the confusion or fear they were expecting. And decent people do not conduct family business in the dead of the night, Julian. Clara stepped forward, instantly positioning herself between her husband and me, seizing control of the narrative. She didn't bother with the title of dad. She hadn't used it since the funeral. Elias, please, this isn't the time for pleasantries. Her voice dripped with a toxic, synthetic sweetness she reserved for waitstaff she intended to stiff on a tip. We tried to call you all day, you didn't answer. We were extremely worried about you. I looked at the black rotary phone resting on the console table in the hallway. It hadn't rung once in 3 days. Worried. I tasted the bitter irony of the word on my tongue. Yes, Elias, worried. Clara's eyes narrowed, a predatory glint flashing in the dim light. She gestured toward the hulking figure by the door. This is Dr. Vance. We brought him because things have gotten out of hand. Your behavior. Your memory. The isolation out here. It's not safe for you to be alone anymore." The silence in the foyer thickened, heavy and suffocating. The thrumming of the diesel engine outside seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the floorboards. I looked at the small, brass navigational compass sitting on the entryway table, the golden detail of Sarah's life. She used to tap the glass face of it every time she walked past, a quiet superstition to ensure we never lost our way. I rested my calloused hand over it, feeling the cold metal against my palm. "I see." I kept my voice soft, my eyes locking onto Clara's dead, calculating stare. "Why don't we go into the study then? If you're so worried about my health, we shouldn't stand in a draft." Clara's lips curled into a faint, triumphant smirk. She thought she had already won. She thought she had successfully ambushed a broken, senile old man who was too exhausted to fight back. She didn't know that when you spend your life building ships to survive the most violent storms on Earth, you learn exactly how to build a trap that waits silently beneath the surface. Clara didn't reach down to help her husband. The predatory, unyielding alliance they had forged to dismantle my life shattered the moment the financial abyss opened beneath her feet. She looked at Julian curled on the floorboards, her features twisting into a mask of absolute, paralyzing revulsion. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She didn't even say goodbye. She simply adjusted her expensive wool coat, stepped carefully around his weeping form to avoid ruining her leather heels, and walked out of the study. The heavy front door opened, letting out a violent shriek of wind, and slammed shut a second later. Julian was entirely alone. The syndicate debt, the impending federal indictments, the absolute loss of his father, the crushing atmospheric pressure of it all finally broke whatever fragile architecture remained inside his mind. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his movements agonizingly sluggish, of mimicking the stiff, uncoordinated gait of a man waking up from a devastating car wreck. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the grain of the floorboards, dragging himself down the hallway and out into the freezing deluge of the Pacific storm. When the deadbolt clicked shut for the final time, the suffocating tension that had gripped the house evaporated, replaced by the profound, resonant silence of a vessel that had successfully weathered a rogue wave. Thomas remained in the shadows of the library. For a long moment, he quietly picked up his tablet, turning off the screen. He stepped fully into the study, reaching out to gently touch the embossed gold seal of Sarah's historic conservancy document resting on my desk. He offered a small, imperceptible nod to the empty chair beside me, a silent, reverent acknowledgement of his sister's brilliance, before turning to face me. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply walked to the kitchen, the heavy thud of his boots echoing in the quiet house, and began brewing a pot of bitter black coffee. We sat in the dark living room until the gray, bruised light of dawn finally began to bleed through the rain-streaked windows. The winter that followed was the coldest on record, but the house never felt entirely empty again. The destruction of Julian and Clara played out exactly as Thomas had calculated, unspooling with a brutal, bureaucratic efficiency. The federal marshals executed their warrants 4 days later. The encrypted video file from my study, paired with Dr. Vance's immediate and cowardly cooperation with the authorities, provided an airtight narrative. Julian was indicted on federal charges of wire fraud, attempted extortion, and elder abuse. Clara faced the same, with added counts of medical fraud and conspiracy. But the federal courts were the least of their terrors. The Las Vegas syndicate didn't care about their legal troubles. When Thursday morning arrived and the margin call went unanswered, the private equity firm systematically dismantled Julian's life. They seized the architectural firm, liquidated the assets, and foreclosed on the Palisades estate before the first snow fell. Julian's frantic attempts to secure a plea deal resulted in a 42-month sentence in a low-security federal facility in Nevada. Clara, attempting to shift the entirety of the blame onto her husband, found no sympathy from the judge. She received 3 years. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't read the transcript. You don't perform an autopsy on a tumor after it has been successfully excised from your body. Thomas stayed through the new year. He helped me re-caulk the drafty windows in the sunroom, cooked heavily spiced venison stews that made the house smell like a hunting lodge, and sat with me on the porch watching the freezing tide roll into the marina. In late January, he packed his bags, loaded his truck, and drove back to Bend. He told me, his voice carrying that familiar, unyielding iron, that a man my age needed to figure out how to navigate his own waters again. He was right. In early March, when the coastal frost finally began to surrender to the pale spring sun, Maya came home. My daughter had spent the last 12 years teaching marine biology at a university in Boston, raising two fiercely intelligent little girls who possessed their grandmother's sharp green eyes. I hadn't told her about the nightmare in November. I hadn't wanted to drag her into the suffocating gravity of her brother's betrayal. But she knew. A daughter always knows when the tenor of her father's voice changes over the phone. She took a sabbatical, packed her daughters into a station wagon, and drove across the country, refusing to leave until she was certain the foundation of my life was secure. The cavernous, echoing museum of my grief was instantly shattered by the chaotic, beautiful noise of children. They ran down the historic wooden docks, their laughter cutting through the salt air, chasing the gulls away from the fishing trawlers. One afternoon, my youngest granddaughter, Alara, wandered into my drafting study. She was 7 years old, carrying the distinct scent of sea salt and crushed pine needles. She stood on her tiptoes, peering over the edge of my massive oak desk. Her eyes locked onto a heavy, solid brass plumb bob resting near my blueprints, a tool I had used for 40 years to ensure the vertical bulkheads of my ships were perfectly straight. She reached out, her small fingers wrapping around the cold metal, testing its weight. She asked me why it was so heavy. I knelt beside her, my knee joints protesting with a dull ache, and gently guided her hand. I told her that when you are building something designed to survive the worst storms in the world, you have to know exactly where true center is. You have to ensure the spine of the ship is straight. Because if it leans even a fraction of an inch, the pressure of the ocean will eventually tear the whole structure apart. She nodded, placing the heavy brass tool carefully back onto the vellum, a quiet understanding settling over her features. She possessed a purity of spirit that her uncle had traded away a long time ago. I think about that November night more often than I care to admit, the throbbing diesel engine in the driveway, the agonizing click of the forged key in the deadbolt, the terrifying neon orange cap of the syringe descending toward my arm. I think about the absolute devastating realization that the child I raised had transformed into a monster wearing his face. But mostly I think about the profound architectural mechanics of human morality. A man builds his character the exact same way. He builds a deep-water hull. You lay the keel in the dark. Choice by choice, year by year, you either reinforce the timber with honor or you allow the rot to set in through 1,000 tiny compromises. Julian allowed his keel to rot. Clara invited the dampness in. And when the massive, violent pressure of the syndicate debt crashed into their lives, their entire moral structure collapsed at the seams. It wasn't a tragic stroke of bad luck. It was just the inevitable physics of a ruined foundation. What saved me wasn't physical strength. I am a 71-year-old man with fused vertebrae and a tired heart. What saved me was the quiet, invisible fortress constructed by a dying woman who loved me enough to see the storm coming when I was too blind to look at the horizon. Wisdom isn't about being paranoid. Wisdom is the profound act of doing the small, unshowy thing to protect the people you love, even when you know you won't be around to see it work. I learned something else that night. Staring down the barrel of my own institutionalization, I learned the true definition of nerve. We are taught that courage is loud. We are taught that it is a sudden, violent reaction, a shouting match, a frantic scrambling for a weapon. But true courage, the kind that breaks the people trying to break you, is entirely silent. It is the absolute, unyielding refusal to be moved. It is the ability to sit in a leather chair, surrounded by the worst version of the people you love, listening to them say the most monstrous things they are capable of, and not flinching, not signing the paper, not surrendering the pen. The world assumes that because you are old, because your hands shake and your joints ache, your dignity is something easily stolen in the dark. They believe they can pry it from your fingers with forged documents and whispered threats. But your dignity does not belong to the state. It does not belong to your betrayers. It is the heavy brass plumb bob resting at the center of your chest. You keep it because you built it. You keep it because you earned it. Hold on to your center, even when the door is unlocking. Even when the people you raised are the ones holding the needle. Keep your spine perfectly straight, stare directly into the dark, and let them break themselves against your hull. The command to just go to sleep hung in the air, a grotesque lullaby sung by a woman holding a loaded gun to my legacy. I looked at the silver pen resting against the faded blue ink of an old hull schematic, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence settling over the room. The polished metal was heavy and ice-cold against my calloused skin, holding the temperature of the freezing storm outside. I turned it slowly in my fingers, feeling the engraved ridges of the barrel. My mouth was entirely dry, coated with the bitter, coppery residue of an adrenaline spike I was trying desperately to suppress. From the doorway, a new, distinct odor began to bleed into the comforting scent of my pipe tobacco. It was the sterile, stinging smell of isopropyl alcohol and cheap latex drifting from the open maw of Dr. Vance's canvas bag. I looked down at the forged medical dossier Clara had placed so triumphantly on my desk. The header bore the official, embossed crest of a psychiatric clinic 200 miles away in Portland. The diagnosis was typed in a sterile, authoritative font: advanced vascular dementia, acute paranoid ideation, unfit for financial governance. Beside it lay the deed transfer, 3 pages of dense legal jargon deliberately designed to sever a man from 40 years of blood, sweat, and fractured bone. I didn't look at Clara. I shifted my gaze to the man cowering just behind her shoulder. Julian. I didn't raise my voice. I let it scrape across the silence like heavy grit sandpaper. Look at me. He flinched. It was a pathetic, involuntary twitch, but the ingrained authority of a father over his son forced his chin up. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, ringed with dark, sunken hollows of exhaustion. He looked at me, but he couldn't maintain the focus. His gaze kept sliding away, darting to the floorboards, to the windows, to anywhere but the face of the man who had taught him how to walk. "Dad, you have to understand," Julian stammered, his voice thin and reedy, lacking any of the resonance a grown man should possess. "The marina is drowning you. The maintenance, the dredging taxes, the union fees. You can't keep up anymore. It's too much for you. We have buyers." Developers out of Seattle who want to turn the deep water slips into a luxury yacht basin. We can make sure you're comfortable. You won't have to worry about the winters here ever again. The absolute putrid rot of his soul was finally exposed under the green light. He wasn't even attempting to take over the family business. He was liquidating it. "You're selling the slips." I stated it as a cold, immovable fact, letting my profound disgust alter the temperature of the room. 40 years of union contracts, 50 families in Astoria who rely on those docks to launch their trawlers and feed their children, and you're going to pave it all over for floating cocktail lounges and glass condominiums. It's business, Elias. Clara stepped forward, violently slamming her palm flat against the wood of my drafting table. The sudden impact made the silver pen jump. "The town is dying. The fishing industry is dead. You are sitting on $8 million of prime coastal acreage, and you are letting it rot because you're trapped in the past. We are not asking for your permission anymore. We are executing a necessary intervention." An intervention. I let a short, humorless breath escape my chest. "Is that what you call swapping my heart medication for aspirin, Clara? Is that what you call turning on the gas stove while I'm reading, trying to blow my home into the Pacific?" Julian's face went the color of wet ash. He whipped his head toward his wife, his mouth falling open in a display of genuine, panicked shock. He hadn't known about the pills. He hadn't known about the stove. The coward had authorized the theft of my estate, but he had left the dirty physical mechanics of the gaslighting entirely to his wife. Clara didn't even blink. Her flat reptilian eyes remained locked on mine. She didn't deny it. She didn't defend herself. She simply realized that the illusion of her faux concern was no longer necessary. She turned her head slightly, giving a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the hulking shadow by the door. Dr. Vance stepped fully into the room. He spat his piece of gum into a crumpled tissue. Shoving it into his pocket, he reached his thick, latex-gloved hand deep into the black canvas bag. The sharp, sickening clink of a needle piercing a rubber stopper echoed over the drumming of the rain. He drew the plunger back, extracting a heavy dose of amber liquid into the clear plastic chamber. "This is your final warning, Elias." Clara's tone dropped the patronizing sweetness entirely, revealing the raw, unadulterated venom beneath. "Dr. Vance is a licensed medical professional. He has determined you are suffering from a severe psychotic break, making you an immediate danger to your own physical safety. If you do not sign that transfer right now, he will administer 5 milligrams of haloperidol." Dr. Vance flicked the side of the syringe with his thick index finger, clearing a tiny air bubble. "The transport team waiting in the driveway will carry you out of this house," Clara continued, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a terrifying clinical whisper. "By tomorrow morning, a judge in Portland will grant Julian emergency conservatorship based on the physician's hold. You will wake up strapped to a mattress in a state ward smelling of bleach and urine. The state will take control of your assets. We will petition the court, and you will never smell the ocean again. Sign the paper." I stared at the syringe resting in the doctor's hand. The bright neon orange plastic cap on the plunger was completely incongruous with the dim, elegant mahogany and vellum of my study. It looked like a child's toy, cheap and vibrant, yet it held the terrifying power to erase my agency. It was the physical manifestation of bureaucratic violence, designed to strip away my dignity and lock my mind inside a chemical cage while they pillaged my life. The fear they expected me to show, the desperate, weeping surrender of a broken old man, never materialized. Instead, a deep, glacial calm washed over my chest. The psychological shift was absolute. I was no longer the prey cornered in a trap. I was the architect watching the final support beam of their delusion prepare to snap. I picked up the silver pen. I didn't move it toward the signature line. I simply aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of the forged medical dossier, ensuring the angles were precise. No, just one word, the absolute. Unyielding refusal to be moved by the worst people in the world doing the worst things they were capable of. Clara's jaw tightened. A flash of pure, unchecked hatred contorted her features. She took a step back from the desk, yielding the floor. "Do it, Doctor." Dr. Vance moved. He closed the distance between the doorway and my desk with heavy, determined strides. He raised the syringe, stepping into the edge of the emerald light, reaching out with his left hand to pin my shoulder to the leather chair while the needle descended toward my arm. But before his boot could strike the floorboards, for the final step, a sharp metallic spark illuminated the pitch-black doorway of the adjoining library. The single word of my refusal hung in the freezing air, heavier than the rain battering the cedar siding. I didn't move my hands from the desk. I simply watched the terrifying neon orange cap of the syringe descend toward my arm, the sterile, stinging odor of isopropyl alcohol and cheap latex blooming from Dr. Vance's bag aggressively overpowered the comforting scent of my pipe tobacco. My mouth tasted entirely of copper and stale adrenaline. Yet, beneath the instinctual, animal panic of a cornered man, a profound glacial calm anchored my chest. I wasn't just waiting for the needle. I was waiting for the tide to turn her turn. Dr. Vance's heavy boot squeaked against the polished hardwood. He reached out with his left hand, his thick fingers curling into a vise designed to pin my shoulder to the leather backing of my chair. Snick hiss, the sharp, metallic rasp of flint striking steel violently ruptured the suffocating tension in the room. A sudden, brilliant teardrop of orange fire erupted from the absolute pitch blackness of the adjoining library. It cast long, erratic, dancing shadows across the spines of the leather-bound maritime encyclopedias lining the walls. The flame hovered there in the dark for 3 agonizing seconds, burning away the sterile stench of the doctor's bag and replacing it with the rich, sharp scent of toasted butane and Cuban tobacco. Then, the heavy brass lid snapped shut with a hollow, resonant clack. Dr. Vance froze. His arm hung suspended in the empty space between us, the amber liquid inside the plastic barrel trembling visibly. Clara inhaled a sharp, ragged breath, a wet sound of shock that entirely shattered her meticulously cultivated clinical composure. Julian violently recoiled, stumbling backward until his shoulder blades collided hard against the mahogany doorframe, a pathetic, choked gasp escaping his throat. A figure stepped slowly out of the shadows and into the emerald halo of my desk lamp. It was Tosimus. My late wife's older brother didn't move like an elderly man startled awake by intruders. He moved with the terrifying, predatory patience of a man who had been sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for the precise moment the rats fully entered the trap. At 68, Thomas still carried the rigid, uncompromising posture of a steel I-beam. For 32 years, he hadn't built ships. He had operated as a senior forensic investigator for the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission. Working out of their Seattle field office, he had spent his entire adult life forensically dismantling corporate extortion rings, tracking offshore syndicate money, and looking arrogant white-collar sociopaths directly in the eye while stripping them of their freedom. He viewed human greed not as a tragic emotional failing, but as a sloppy, predictable mathematical equation. He wore a heavy charcoal wool sweater and dark slacks, entirely unbothered by the freezing temperature of the drafty house. In his left hand, he held Sarah's vintage brass Zippo lighter. In his right hand, resting casually against his ribcage, he held a sleek, titanium-backed tablet. The screen cast a pale, icy blue luminescence against his stern features. In the upper right corner of the glass, a tiny red icon pulsed with a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. "Good morning, Clara." Thomas kept his voice a rich, deep baritone, entirely devoid of panic or anger. It carried the clinical, immovable weight of a falling guillotine. "You're looking remarkably tense for a woman who just orchestrated a felony." Julian's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, a suffocating fish hauled onto the deck. "Uncle Thomas," he finally croaked, the words tearing from his throat, pitching into the reedy whine of the frightened 12-year-old boy who used to hide in the boatyard. "What are you doing here? You live in Bend." "I did." Thomas took a slow, deliberate step around the edge of my drafting table, keeping his terrifying focus gaze locked entirely on the doctor holding the needle. Until Elias called me 2 weeks ago, noting the sudden appearance of generic aspirin in his blood pressure bottles and the phantom ignition of his kitchen stove, it seemed my late sister's husband was experiencing a rather aggressive campaign of domestic sabotage. So, I packed a bag. I've been living silently in the guest suite above the carriage house for 14 days. Thomas placed the tablet gently onto the desk, resting it squarely on top of Clara's forged medical dossier. He tapped the screen with a single, deliberate strike of his index finger. The pale blue light flared, illuminating a grid of 4 high-definition video feeds. The lenses were wide-angle, capturing everything. One feed displayed the rain-slicked driveway, clearly showing the license plate of the idling white medical transport van. Another showed a perfect top-down view of the foyer. The largest frame displayed the exact room we were standing in, capturing the entire confrontation in flawless 4K resolution. It showed Julian cowering by the door. It showed Clara hovering over the deed transfer. It showed the bright orange cap of the syringe in Dr. Vance's hand. "Let us discuss the architecture of your extortion, Clara." Thomas dropped his tone into a register of pure bureaucratic ice. "For the past 2 weeks, this entire property has been wired with concealed motion-activated infrared cameras. The audio sensors are highly sensitive. I heard the threat of the chemical restraint. I heard the blackmail regarding the deed transfer. I heard your complete, unvarnished admission regarding the gas stove." Clara lunged. It was a sudden, violent spasm of desperation. Her manicured hand snapped toward the tablet, driven by the instinctual animalistic urge to destroy the digital evidence of her crimes. Before her fingertips could even graze the glass, Thomas slammed his palm down hard over hers, pinning her hand flat against the heavy oak desk. The force of it was startling, a sudden kinetic burst of raw physical strength from a man they had entirely dismissed as an elderly relic. He didn't flinch. He just held her there, letting her feel the absolute, immovable weight of her own trap. "I wouldn't," Thomas whispered, leaning in so close that she had to stare directly into the reflection of her own terrified face in his wire-rimmed glasses. "That device is merely a viewfinder, Clara." The audio and 4K video feeds have been live streaming via an encrypted satellite uplink directly to a secure server at the Secchi Enforcement Division in Seattle since the moment you picked the lock on that front door. You could smash this tablet to dust right now, and the federal prosecutor would still have the entire partitioned file downloaded before you reached your car. He slowly released her hand. Clara yanked it back against her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. The architect of the ambush suddenly realized she was entirely sealed inside a vault of her own making. The waxy, translucent pallor of a corpse washed over her skin. Thomas finally turned his attention to the large man in the wet medical scrubs. Dr. Vance was slowly, desperately trying to lower his arm, attempting to slide the uncapped syringe back into his canvas bag without making a sound. "Ah, the good doctor." Thomas pulled a thin, folded piece of paper from the pocket of his sweater. "Arthur Vance, it took me a little while to track down your credentials, considering your medical license was permanently revoked by the Oregon Medical Board 18 months ago for writing fraudulent opioid prescriptions to cash-paying patients." Dr. Vance froze, his thick jaw slackening. The tough guy facade completely evaporated. He was suddenly just a terrified, sweating man holding a chemical weapon in a stranger's house. "I don't know who told you this was a simple snatch and grab of a confused old man," Thomas continued, executing a surgical, icy precision, "but you are currently holding an unprescribed, Schedule II neuroleptic sedative in the home of a highly competent man while being recorded on federal servers. That's not a malpractice suit, Arthur. That is attempted kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, and medical fraud. You are looking at a mandatory federal minimum of 15 years before you even smell a parole board." The primitive survival instinct of a mercenary realizing the contract was burned instantly overrode any financial loyalty. "Dr. Vance dropped the syringe onto my blueprints. The plastic clattered loudly against the wood, rolling over the blue ink of a hull schematic and leaving a tiny smear of amber liquid on the paper. He didn't say a single word. He didn't ask for his money." He turned on his heel, shoving violently past Julian, and bolted down the darkened hallway. 3 seconds later, the heavy brass deadbolt of the front door slammed open, rebounding violently against the foyer wall. A furious gust of the Pacific storm howled down the hallway, carrying the freezing scent of ocean salt and dead pine needles into the house. The frantic roar of the diesel engine outside revved to a high-pitched, agonizing scream. Gravel sprayed against the cedar siding like buckshot as the unmarked white van tore blindly out of the driveway, its bloody red taillights instantly swallowed by the blinding sheet of the coastal squall. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, sealing the house once more. We were alone. The silence that reclaimed the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic, violent drumming of the rain against the glass. Julian slid slowly down the doorframe, his expensive wool coat bunching up around his shoulders. His knees gave out entirely and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, pulling his legs toward his chest. He began to weep. It wasn't the cathartic weeping of a man seeking forgiveness. It was the desperate, pathetic whimpering of a coward who had just realized his lifeboat was sinking. I looked at him, searching the very bottom of my soul for a flicker of paternal sympathy. There was nothing. The golden detail of my grief was a tiny faded crescent scar on Julian's chin, right below his lip. He had gotten it at 7 years old, slipping on the slick, algae-covered docks while bravely trying to help me tie off a heavy mooring line in a gale. I had held a blood-soaked rag to his face that afternoon, wiping away his tears, telling him he was the strongest boy I knew. Looking at that exact same scar now, illuminated by the harsh light of his own cowardice, I felt a strange, cavernous void open in my chest. The brave boy who used to help me sand down oak beams was dead. He had been dead for a very long time. Only this pathetic, ruined stranger remained. I picked up the syringe from my blueprints and tossed it into the metal wastebasket beside my desk. The hollow thunk echoed through the study. "It's over, Julian." The words scraped out of my throat, completely drained of emotion. "You can leave now." But Thomas wasn't finished. The sentinel in the shadows hadn't just come to stop a kidnapping, he had come to execute an absolute financial demolition. Thomas reached down and picked up his tablet. He tapped the screen, closing the camera feeds and opening a complex, color-coded financial spreadsheet. He looked at my son crying on the floor, a cruel, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Oh, it's not over, Elias," Thomas murmured, his eyes locking onto Clara's horrified face as she realized the true depth of their ruin. "We haven't even discussed the margin debt yet, and we certainly haven't discussed what Sarah did to the title of this property before she died." The cavernous void in my chest didn't fill with triumph as I watched my son weeping on the hardwood floor. It filled with a cold, terrifying curiosity about what had finally broken him. When a man trades his soul for a forged deed and a chemical restraint, he doesn't do it for the promise of a luxury yacht basin. He does it because a much darker tide is already pulling him under. I rested my calloused hands flat against the cool, worn wood of my drafting table, the bitter taste of stale adrenaline finally giving way to the dry ash of anticipation. Thomas didn't lower the titanium-backed tablet. He held it suspended in the emerald glow of my desk lamp, his finger gliding smoothly across the glass to expand a dense, color-coded spreadsheet. The pale blue luminescence shifted, painting sharp, digital angles across the rigid lines of his face. "You see, Elias," Thomas kept his voice conversational, a terrifyingly casual tone for a man dissecting a corpse. "When you called me regarding the missing keys and the swapped medication, I didn't just pack a bag. I ran a forensic audit on Julian's architectural holding company. It took my analysts at the Seattle office exactly 3 hours to find the rot." Julian's whimpering abruptly stopped. He snapped his head up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing horror. The panicked breath hitched in his throat, producing a wet, choking sound that barely cut through the drumming of the storm against the glass. "You didn't secure backing from developers in Seattle, did you, Julian?" Thomas turned the tablet slightly, directing the screen toward Clara. "You took a bridge loan. $7.4 million from a private equity syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. A syndicate known for predatory lending practices and extremely aggressive collection methods." Clara physically recoiled. The arrogant, clinical posture she had maintained all night completely collapsed. She stared at the screen, her eyes tracing the digital columns. A cluster of spreadsheet cells at the bottom glowed an angry, vibrant crimson. The red light reflected perfectly off the expensive, spherical white pearls of her necklace, transforming the jewels into a string of tiny, glowing drops of blood resting against her collarbone. It was the absolute, undeniable mark of a woman bleeding out financially. They called the margin on Tuesday. Thomas tapped the glass with a sharp, rhythmic clack. "You owe them $8.2 million, including the exorbitant interest, by Thursday morning. Tomorrow. If you don't wire the funds, they don't just seize your holding company. They seize your home in the Palisades. They seize your personal accounts. They seize the cars, the watches, the investment portfolios. They will strip you down to the copper wiring in your walls." The sharp floral scent of Clara's expensive perfume suddenly soured, overpowered by the raw, acrid stench of her nervous sweat. She looked down at her husband crumpled on the floor. There was no empathy in her gaze. There was no tragic solidarity of a couple facing ruin together. Her eyes held nothing but raw, venomous disgust. The parasitic bond had finally encountered a host it couldn't drain. "You told me it was a standard commercial loan." Clara's voice was a ragged, breathless hiss, entirely stripped of its former venom. She stepped away from him, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. "You told me the Seattle developers were underwriting the acquisition. They backed out." Julian buried his face in his trembling hands, his voice muffled by his own despair. "The permit zoning, it was taking too long. I needed the capital to keep the firm afloat. I just needed collateral. I just needed the marina on paper for 48 hours to restructure the debt. And you were willing to lock your father in a psychiatric ward to get it, Thomas observed, the quiet disgust in his baritone carrying the weight of a judge rendering a verdict. A desperate, sloppy gamble, but unfortunately for you, Julian, your collateral is completely worthless. Julian lowered his hands. Clara froze, her gaze snapping back to the older man in the shadows. Thomas reached out and gently picked up the thick forged deed transfer Clara had placed on my desk. He held the crisp white pages by the corner, looking at them with the mild annoyance of a man inspecting a stain on his shoe, before dropping them into the metal wastebasket beside the discarded syringe. You assumed your mother left the marina to Elias in a standard spousal trust, Thomas continued, stepping fully into the light and resting his hands on the drafting table. You assumed the title was free and clear, ripe to be leveraged the moment you seized legal conservatorship, but Sarah was always the smartest person in the room, and she saw the rot in you long before Elias was willing to admit it. My breath caught. A sudden, phantom warmth ghosted across the back of my neck, cutting through the freezing draft of the room. It felt exactly like the weight of Sarah's hand resting on my shoulder. 6 weeks before she passed, Thomas's voice softened, losing its bureaucratic edge to make room for profound reverence. While she was confined to the hospice bed in the living room, listening to the oxygen machine hum, Sarah called me. She asked me to draft a highly specific, irrevocable legal structure. We bypassed the standard estate lawyers entirely. Thomas pulled a single folded document from the inside pocket of his charcoal sweater. It wasn't printed on standard copy paper. It was heavy, cream-colored linen stock, bearing the raised, embossed gold seal of the United States Department of the Interior. He unfolded it slowly and laid it flat on the desk. "This property isn't a private commercial asset anymore," Thomas stated, the finality of his words echoing like a steel vault slamming shut. In April of last year, Sarah and I successfully petitioned the federal government to designate these 80 acres and the deep water slips as a Class A historic maritime conservancy. It is permanently bound to the National Register. Clara's jaw slackened. The remaining color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin the color of wet parchment. "Do you understand what that means, Clara?" Thomas asked, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "It means the land cannot be sold. It cannot be legally It cannot be leveraged as collateral for a loan, and it absolutely cannot be paved over for luxury condominiums. Elias doesn't own it in a way you can steal. He is merely the federally appointed, lifetime steward of a protected historical site. The marina belongs to the history of the Oregon coast, forever." I stared at the gold seal gleaming under the green lamp. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of my late wife's brilliance crashed into me like a rogue wave. While her lungs were failing, while her body was shutting down, she had used every last ounce of her fading energy to build an indestructible, invisible fortress around me. She had looked at the greed infecting her son and quietly, methodically, severed his hands before he could even reach for the knife. I didn't cry for my son's ruin. I sat perfectly still in my chair, swallowing the overwhelming surge of awe for the woman who had protected me from beyond the grave. "So, you see the tragic irony of your night," Thomas murmured, picking up his tablet and turning off the screen. "Even if you had drugged Elias, even if you had dragged him into that van and locked him in a state ward, even if you forged his signature 1,000 times over, you would be handing the syndicate a piece of paper that legally means nothing. You have no collateral, you have no assets." Julian let out a sound that wasn't entirely human, a hollow, scraping wail of absolute, unmitigated despair. He curled entirely in on himself on the floorboards, a man realizing he was tethered to a stone, plunging rapidly toward the dark bottom of the ocean. Clara didn't scream, she didn't argue. She stared at the federal document on the desk, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The terrifying reality of Thursday morning was finally settling over her. The syndicate wasn't going to care about her forged medical documents. They were going to demand their $8 million. And when they didn't get it, the violence they would inflict wouldn't be bureaucratic. The federal marshals will be reviewing the live-streamed footage in the morning. Thomas checked his watch, a vintage silver chronometer that caught the dim light. I imagine the indictments for wire fraud, attempted kidnapping, and elder abuse will be unsealed by Friday. That is, of course, if the gentlemen from Las Vegas don't find you first. Thomas stepped back into the shadows of the library, the glow of his tablet completely extinguished. He had executed his duty with the flawless mechanical precision of a firing squad. I looked down at the two architects of my intended destruction. They were entirely destroyed, stripped of their weapons and their collateral, left with nothing but the suffocating weight of the storm they had invited into my home. But the true horror of their punishment wasn't the looming financial ruin or the federal prison sentences. It was the fact that they still had to walk back out into the freezing dark. Clara's triumphant smirk was the exact expression of a predator watching the steel jaws of a trap snap shut. She thought I was surrendering, simply because I turned my back to her and began walking down the darkened hallway. I didn't rush my steps. I let my heavy boots strike the floorboards with a slow, rhythmic finality, leading the three of them away from the echoing foyer and toward the rear of the house. The air in my drafting study always smelled of old vellum, dried cedar shavings, and the lingering ghost of my pipe tobacco. I reached out in the dark, my fingers finding the familiar cold brass chain of the banker's lamp on my desk. A sharp tug brought the heavy green glass to life, casting a warm emerald pool of light across the scattered maritime blueprints and the worn leather of my wingback chairs. The rain lashed furiously against the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, a chaotic drumming that masked the heavy synchronized breathing of the intruders standing in my doorway. I took my seat behind the massive oak desk. I didn't offer them the chairs, looking at my son as he nervously shifted his weight onto his right foot. I realized something fundamental about human ruin. A massive deep-water vessel doesn't sink because of a single catastrophic wave. A hull fails because of a slow, silent rot in the woodwork. It happens in the dark, below the waterline, where nobody bothers to check. Year by year, compromise by compromise, the microscopic fibers of the timber surrender their integrity to the dampness. Julian's character had decayed the exact same way. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to extort his widowed father. He became this hollowed-out shell through 1,000 quiet, cowardly choices. A failed business venture covered up with a lie, a corner cut on a construction contract, a blind eye turned to his wife's escalating greed. He had let his moral keel rot, and now, under the violent pressure of this storm, his entire structure was collapsing. The rot had finally breached the surface 6 months ago. It started in July, just a few weeks after Sarah's headstone was placed in the earth. Clara had insisted on coming over every Sunday to check on my grief. I remember the suffocating afternoon heat baking the driveway. When I reached for my truck keys on the kitchen counter, they were gone. I tore the house apart for 3 hours, a cold, creeping panic tightening my chest. I finally found them buried at the bottom of the deep freezer in the garage, frozen beneath a bag of crushed ice. Clara had watched me unearth them, her eyes wide with a perfectly rehearsed, theatrical sorrow. She placed a manicured hand over her mouth, whispering words about cognitive decline, grief, and the tragic inevitability of a slipping mind. I almost believed her. A grieving mind is a fragile, treacherous thing, desperate for any narrative that makes sense of the fog. But then came the second week of August. I had been reading in the study when a sharp, acidic odor clawed its way up my sinuses. The pungent, undeniable smell of mercaptan, the sulfur additive they put in natural gas. I moved to the kitchen with a speed my battered joints rarely allowed. The heavy cast iron knob of the front right burner was turned fully open, hissing a steady, invisible stream of poison into the enclosed room. I snapped it off, throwing open the patio doors to the coastal wind. Clara stepped into the kitchen 2 minutes later, dropping her teacup so it shattered loudly against the tile. Her voice trembled with weaponized terror as she accused me of almost blowing the house into the Pacific. I looked at her hands that day. There was no tremor. There was no fear. There was only the cold, clinical calculation. of an architect laying the foundation for a demolition. I hadn't touched that stove in 2 days. The absolute confirmation of their malice came in October. The golden detail of their betrayal was an amber plastic prescription bottle sitting beside my bathroom sink, my blood pressure medication. I tipped a pill into my palm one morning and tossed it to the back of my throat. The taste hit my tongue instantly, a bitter chalk residue that lacked the slick, enteric coating of my usual prescription. I spit it out into my palm. It was a generic aspirin, perfectly identical in size and color to the medication keeping my heart beating steadily. Clara had swapped them. She wasn't just trying to convince the world I was losing my mind. She was actively trying to induce the physiological symptoms of a stroke to prove her case. There is a very specific kind of devastation that paralyzes a father when he realizes the family he built is actively trying to destroy him. It feels like swallowing shattered glass. For 3 days after the pill incident, I sat in my workshop, staring at the bandsaw, letting the absolute horror of their betrayal wash over me. But I am a shipwright. You don't try to patch a beam that is entirely consumed by dry rot. You step back, you analyze the structural failure, and you prepare to tear the whole section out by the roots. So I played the part. I let my hands shake when I poured coffee in front of Julian. I intentionally called Clara by my late wife's name. I let my shoulders slump, transforming into the terrified, disoriented old man they desperately needed me to be. I fed their arrogance, giving them the exact rope they needed to hang themselves, while I quietly began gathering the nails for their coffins. The sharp snap of a heavy leather portfolio being unzipped pulled me violently back to the present. Clara stepped forward, placing a thick stack of legal documents onto the center of my drafting desk. The crisp white paper glowed offensively under the green light of the lamp. Dr. Vance, the hulking shadow in the wet medical scrubs kissa, shifted his weight, moving to block the only exit. He unzipped the black canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. The harsh, metallic sound of a heavy zipper in a quiet room is louder than a gunshot when you know what it conceals. Let's make this simple, Elias. Clara rested her fingertips on the documents, leaning across the desk. Her expensive perfume, a sharp floral scent that smelled entirely out of place in my workshop, wafted over the wood. We have power of attorney forms here, transferring the title of the marina and the coastal acreage to Julian C. We also have a letter of medical necessity. She tapped a single, heavily stamped document near the top. Dr. Vance has already signed a preliminary assessment stating you are an immediate danger to yourself. If you sign the transfer, Julian will graciously place you in a private, high-end assisted living facility in Portland. If you refuse, Clara let the sentence hang in the frigid air. She didn't look at Julian, she didn't need to. The coward was staring a hole into the floorboards, completely incapable of meeting his father's eyes while his wife delivered the execution order. If I refuse, I echoed, keeping my voice a raspy, defeated whisper. What then? Then Dr. Vance signs the 72-hour emergency psychiatric hold right now. Clara's eyes widened, a terrifying mask of mock sympathy stretching across her face. And the nice men in the transport van outside will administer a chemical sedative to ensure you don't hurt yourself during the ride to the state psychiatric ward. They aren't known for their gentle touch, Elias, and state wards aren't known for their comfortable beds. You will lose the marina, you will lose this house, and you will spend your final years locked in a sterile room eating pureed food. I looked down at the paperwork. The bold black ink of the deed transfer seemed to vibrate against the white page. Millions of dollars of generational wealth, a lifetime of bleeding knuckles and freezing mornings on the docks, all reduced to a single dotted line. They had brought the full, terrifying weight of the legal and medical establishment straight into my sanctuary. It was a flawless, airtight trap. Clara slid a silver Mont Blanc pen across the drafting table. The heavy metal rolled over a set of old blueprints, the polished nib gleaming in the low emerald light like a surgical scalpel. She didn't realize she was handing a blade to a man who had already built the gallows. Sign it, Elias. Her voice was a venomous whisper. Sign it and go to sleep.